Sense Space, Wrestling with Christianity, Part 3. Today I'm here with Ken Lowry, Mahon McCann, and Mr. O.G. Rose. This is a really, really pertinent dialogue. This is actually the emergent cross-weaving of several pertinent dialogues I've had with each of these gentlemen, each of whom are on a philosophical, theological journey into this question and what it means for our time. So I think we can begin from an assumption that we've all realized there's something here to be wrestled with, something of value to be discovered, perhaps to be integrated. And from my standpoint, that integration does have both the quality of drawing forth something of the old and taking the form of something new. And this is a very exciting and creatively demanding and inspiring prospect because it doesn't look like what we've seen before. And I think that where we've gotten up to in the previous dialogues with Ken and Daniel and Joseph was a notion of a Christianity that goes beyond itself, a Christianity that puts itself into dialogue with things beyond itself in a deep way, in a dialogos kind of way, which means it can actually be transformed and changed by its interactions with philosophy, with things like plant medicine, with other new cultural trends, with AI, and so on. And so this is the kind of landscape we're stepping into. There are a few threads that are kind of open in the air, in particular what this Christianity beyond itself looks like, as well as the relationship between Christianity and philosophy in this time, in this digital liminal age. And finally, the relationship between Christianity or the Christ self and the shadow masculine is a deeply alive thread for me as well that I'm bringing in today. So I'd love to explore all of that. But before we do, I want to invite each of you to give a little introduction to who you are, why you are participating in this dialogue, and any pieces that you want to bring to the table at the outset.
Well, I guess I'll start. I'm happy to be here again with you, Jacob, and OG Rose, and then it's nice to meet you, Mahon. I do think that Christianity, it's the milieu I was born into. We all are to some degree, and for me, that was very explicit. And the going beyond itself idea, I think, is a good way to start to talk about how I think about it, because for me, that's been my experience with Christ and Christianity since I started to take it seriously, which is a finding something within that which I was born, and then using it to go beyond what the border seemed to be or what I was given as a border. So, yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm sort of the opposite of an armchair philosopher. I'm untrained from an academic perspective, but deeply participatory from a lived perspective, and so happy to be here.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, again, just echoing what Ken's saying, I think this is a great conversation, and very happy to be a part of it, because it's a brilliant topic. Like, I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm doing a PhD in philosophy at the moment. I have also been very involved in creative writing. My first stage play was on in Dublin last week, for a week.
Congratulations.
Which was great to see it come alive. Kind of glad it's over now so I can relax for a while. But the process was amazing. But a lot of my work, like across different mediums and stuff, does focus on the question of the meaning crisis, a path to transcendence, wisdom, virtue, those kind of things I felt was missing from my own life. I'm in probably a different position than most, I suppose, because I was raised without religion. So my parents I was never baptized, never made communion. Confirmation was never in a church until I was like 15 or 16. And that was like as a, just going to like a funeral or a wedding or something. So really an outsider of Christianity, but also grew up in a parish in a very Christian Catholic Dublin setting. So I've always been around it, but always as kind of an outsider. But have been kind of against my own will, been dragged to Christianity through my pursuit of truth, basically. And particularly, I suppose, intellectually through Platonism, and then starting to see Platonism and Catholicism and the penny dropping of going, oh, wow, this is actually like the most sophisticated philosophy that there is, basically. So that's been the journey that I've been on. And then obviously, connecting it to like John Vervaeke and Peterson's work. And yeah, what I'm really interested in this conversation is like, is Christianity, does it have to be updated? Does it have to change? How do we contextualize it? Some people seem to think that we need something totally new. Some people are okay with the tradition. I'm kind of interested in what you all think of that. So that's what I'm bringing in this conversation.
Well, gentlemen, it's a delight to be here, and really always a pleasure to speak on this topic. I think wrestling with Christianity is quite important today. I'm Daniel L. Garner. My wife and I go by O.G. Rose, Aquaman Garner Rose pen name. We've been involved in Christianity all our lives. We helped run an organization in Charlottesville for about 8 years called Eunoia, which means beautiful thinking, loosely translated in the Greek, and it's interested in what does the gospel compel you to do as an artist, because I think that field, the relation between creativity and spirituality is quite connected. And I know you gentlemen have spoken with D.C. Sindler, and I'm quite a fan. He also has given lectures on Hans Balthasar, who I'm also quite a fan of. And I think basically on this question of updating Christianity or what that looks like, it is quite funny, the realization of the intellectual resources that seem to have mostly been forgotten by a lot of, dare I say, American churches, notably. Just a recovering of that is an update, but it's an update through realization of something that was always pre-existing, which is always, I think, a lovely avenue to go on, because it's new and yet located in the old, suggesting that the old can be new and that our understandings of linear time might not be so accurate. So I like the idea of bringing forth beauty. So I think that's quite good. I've had a lot of, work in the connections between Christianity and beauty. And also I think Christ is one thing to give people a worldview. It's another thing to give people a model, and another thing to give people a character that participates in a worldview. And I think the question of how do we participate in our beliefs, not just believe our beliefs and have those participations work back on us in a way that condition us and create us in a new way, is very important. And I think you can find those resources in Christianity. So I'm very happy to be here. Everyone here does such marvelous work. So thank you for the invitation, Jacob.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. And I am just sitting into the field in this moment. I don't have a supercharged question that I'm ready to launch at 500 miles an hour. I think we can take a gentle pace with these questions and with this field. At the same time, it does seem to be situated in a fairly urgent civilizational moment of really great and grave transition. And more what I'm finding with this Christianity inquiry is, how does the wrestling with Christianity kind of integrate and weave into that larger nexus of issues? And that's really how I've been thinking of the new Christianity, the Christianity beyond itself, is the thing that is able to kind of address and relate to those challenges. And I'll be particular about that. Just two or three that I'd like to offer in this moment, and we feel free to take this wherever you want to go with it. First and foremost, I've been thinking about psychedelic Christianity in terms of what for me feels like, what am I actually in deepest relationship to, and how could I characterize it? It feels like psychedelic Christianity. And I'm calling it that because it is in the context of relationship with plant medicine that Christianity has opened for me and to me, and the person of Christ has opened for me and to me. In addition to that, the psychoactive, sensuous experience of Christian art, aesthetics, actually connecting with Christian spaces, and understanding the way in which these images are able to resonate through the centuries. This was a very psychedelic kind of insight for me, that the ontological ground inherited at the end of the 21st or 20th century didn't seem to actually afford connecting with that in a holistic way. So there's something about these plant medicines which have actually been very affording for me, and also bear the quality of resolving the disconnections between mind and body and mankind and nature, which also seem to be really deep fault lines in Christianity, and I would say Western culture as a whole. So whatever Christianity comes forth needs to be one that is able to somehow dissolve or integrate these core ruptures that are actually causing the destruction of our environment and substantial degrees of alienation, which surely is a part of the meaning crisis. In addition to that, we have a huge cultural rift between Christianity and progressivism, particularly with the LGBT pride wing of progressivism, but progressivism more broadly, as far as I can tell, sets itself up as a reaction against Christianity. And these two are at odds. So whatever Christianity goes beyond itself has to somehow wrap itself around and include that in a way that gets beyond the current issues. And I would say it has to be something that somehow is able to include real sexual diversity, and in many ways be more of a sensuous Christianity, which is something I touched on with Ken when we talked about the necessity of having Socrates alongside Jesus, and not just having Jesus as a kind of pure being who's transcended sexuality, but something that's immanent and accounts for eros and sexuality. And of course, this also touches on the shadow masculine and the necessity of being rooted in these more primal aspects. And so Socrates also offers us something transformative and dialogical, which again is the core quality of the membrane of a Christianity that goes beyond itself in relationship to all these other things. So that's a little bit of the landscape that really excites me and feels kind of like a very vital edge to this conversation.
I'd like to propose a little bit of maybe a action dynamic. If we might think of wrestling involves two competitors generally, and it's a mutual give and shape. It's a mutual co-shaping event. And I'm sort of seeing there's one half. One of these poles is what we all take to be what's real about Christianity. Maybe it's the truth that Mahon alluded to, that draws you and sort of forces you into the stream. If you want to actually follow truth, you're going to find yourself in some stream that engages Christianity. And maybe what Daniel, what you referenced with the aspects of the tradition that become alive again. And then on our other competitor is the historical manifestation and particular fragmentation of that, which I think includes both the pull of, let's say, a church that is less than what, let's call it big C Christianity on the one hand. It's necessarily less than that which it aspires to become, but also thereby includes internal conflicts, which are the pushbacks to the place where it's lacking, the progressivism that you talk about, Jacob. And so what I would like to, as one example of many, so what I would like to propose is that maybe in fact we are attempting to be the dynamic between the two. we are not in fact wrestling for either side, but we're attempting to become the field and the energy on which these two can in fact do some mutual co-shaping to afford the sort of coming forth from itselfness that maybe we're trying to. So just as an added setting of the stage, as a dynamic of where we go, how we do this.
Well, I'll jump in. I like that framing very much, Ken. And it makes me think, Ivan Illich was very interesting. He said something along the lines where he said, the best of things, only the best of things can become the worst of things. And he's referring to Christianity. And he's talking about the problem of institutional Christianity. What's very interesting with Ivan Illich, and he references the story of the Good Samaritan, where he asks, when we read the story of the Good Samaritan, we're looking for principles or system of ideas of how we're supposed to respond. And he makes the point that when they ask Jesus, who's my neighbor, it's the lawyers, basically the Pharisees, looking for like a legal blueprint of who would qualify as my neighbor, who would not qualify as my neighbor. But Ivan Illich points out that Jesus doesn't really do that. What he suggests is that your neighbor is the one of whom you come upon on the road, who needs your help. And so instead of a system, it's more of an employing of skills, discernment, improvisation, active response. But the temptation of Christianity is always to go into the direction of a very rigid system. But of course, a rigid system is something that you don't have to wrestle with. Also, it takes away risk, discernment, decision-making, thinking for yourself, doing something and defining someone as a neighbor that other people may not define as a neighbor. And therefore, there could be disagreement. And you would have to know how to navigate that disagreement without leading to, say, fights or anything like that. And so the first thing that might come to mind to sort of, I think what Ken was saying there really does bring to mind the warnings of Ivan Illich on where Christianity, and he's going to, of course, put his finger on Constantine and talk about how the institutionalization of Christianity. Now, he's not anti-institution because he argues that humans need institutions to organize their activity. You could even get into the Peter Berger's, Philip Reef, sociological givens, et cetera, so forth. But the issue is it's very, very difficult for human beings not to have institutions and then not outsource their thinking to those institutions so they don't have to be an active thinker, active risk taker, and making active discernments. And it would seem like wrestling, if that's the case, then basically a Christianity you wrestle with is the only Christianity. Because wrestling, you always have to wrestle to make a decision. You always have to wrestle to take a risk. You always have to wrestle to jump in there. And what you see there is the active element of Christianity comes to play. And then to close the point, if you take seriously the active resource, then you're going to look for every single resource you possibly can, whether it be in the tradition, whether it be from diversity, everywhere you're going to look to find the mental models or the abilities to put in your knapsack, if you will, so that when you're on the road and you come upon the person on the side that needs your help, you're able to help them. And then the last point I'll say, I think that may have something also to say with, say, masculinity and different things that you alluded to, Jacob, because it would suggest like the ability to be ready. The Samaritan can pay for the end. The Samaritan can take the person on the side of the road somewhere. He has abilities of which can be employed to help. So there's also something here to suggest that a Christianity that is able to discern, wrestle, make decisions, and then have abilities to employ on a situation that's live, all become very, I think, pronounced and necessary to take seriously if we think about Christianity as something that one wrestles with, as opposed to something that one merely ascribes to.
That's such a good point. There was something that I was thinking of the entire time that's been a real dilemma for me with Christianity, which is, like, ethically speaking, is Christianity a virtue ethic or is it a deontological religion? Because that's kind of the concept. Like, if it's deontological, it's just rule based. It's like, here's the list of rules, you have to follow all those rules. If you break one of those rules, you're not in the club. That's it. Like, whereas if it's a virtue ethic, it's more like, this is the type of character that the Christian virtues are aiming at, which are the kind of the four cardinal virtues, and then love, faith, hope, that these are all actually aiming at a particular character, and they're more principles based. So they're contextual. They require certain decision making. You can't just apply a rules based framework all of the time. And I think if you look at it one way or the other, you get a very different kind of religion. And for me anyway, in Ireland, it's been the deontological interpretation a lot of the time. But that's resulted, I think, in what you were saying, Jacob, which is that it's not really transformative. People are just going through the motions. They're following rules, they're showing up, it's enforcing social order, but it's not transforming people internally because they're not actually acting out the virtues and the transformative practices of the church. So that's something that definitely is very key for me in this transformation.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that a little bit, because this is something that I've thought about a lot and talked about a good bit. That I think the conceptualization of Christianity as a deontological system is precisely what Christianity is not. I think it's precisely this is a little heavy to throw out, but I do think there's an aspect of the notion of the Antichrist that is particularly associated with this. That is the reification of the model, where what I see Christ as doing is attempting to make real players, like real God men, who are alive in a dynamic sort of sense, whereas the attempt at a deontology is a necessarily dead acting out within a dead framework. And so I don't know if virtue ethic, I don't know if I know enough about that, but I think maybe Christianity sort of like goes beyond both of them, in the sense that there is certainly a virtue, like the virtue ethic is certainly there in Christianity, but it's almost something like, I don't know, if just as I hear you say that, I don't know if that includes enough of the mystical component that is properly, I think, in the Kierkegaardian sense, brings you to the properly religious experience of Christianity, as much as I am enthralled with the virtue ethic aspect of Christianity.
Well, I'll just add, basically, there is an incentive for deontological ethics because that allows centralization and then institutionalization. If you have a value ethic, which would align Nicomachean ethics with Aristotle, or kind of the notion that the ethical is going to always be based on habit, character, discernment, judgment, a whole slew of epistemological models that are in the moment, which absolutely can be infused by a mystical concern. The problem is, it's very difficult for moderns to think about, say, virtue ethics or value ethics. There's different ways, because we think about ethics outside of mysticism. This would be a very mistaken concept for the classical, because what do you mean ethics without the mystical? If you don't talk about the mystical, you're not talking about the good. And so what are we even doing? Because it all will come down basically to the Trinity. You could say the good of the true, the beautiful, and the good, right? And so for like Ivan Illich, he would point out that the movement to deontological is then what makes possible institutionalization, which then makes possible, because then you can have general principles. And in order to have a general power structure, you need general principles. And now you have oppression. Now you have the control. Now you have the manipulation. So another reason why a value and virtue ethic structure is so important is because that naturally decentralizes. But in decentralizing, it also creates anxiety, because the individual then has a certain responsibility and they may get it wrong. And if they're not getting an education that helps them know how to pursue, how to be fitted in that particularity, to use a loaded classical term, then they tend to be existentially overwhelmed. And in that anxiety, turn to strongman, totalitarian, and institutions. And then, of course, the most prevalent form of deontological ethics would be like utilitarianism. And the temptation of utilitarianism is that it seems so effective, because you can have these massive general principles, and it seems like, how can you deny that the end should, if it increases happiness, it's good, and so on and so forth. Well, Ivan Illich's entire program is like, that's going to inherently it's going to reduce humans to statistical models. It's going to reduce reality to models. It's going to make it in the territory into maps. And then the human, of which really only comes out in the possibility of getting it wrong. If there's no possibility for the human to get it wrong, then the human can't be fully human. Once that is lost, there will be very little difference between the person and the mammal that is the human being. We simply will be statistical models. But then, of course, that benefits giant power structures. So moving away from something like a virtue or value ethic toward the deontological, I think Ivan Illich would say is characteristic of the modern world, which then, if you try to understand Christianity in that context, it's hard to know what it's doing, right? It doesn't seem to make much sense. Well, if you go to a different framework that's more of a value or virtue structure, it makes a lot more sense, but then it's a lot more existential. Then it involves a lot more risk. But facing that, I think, is part of the wrestling.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the virtues are connected to the mystical in the sense that the virtues are meant as a path of purification for you to see the good. Like they're the transformative path. It's kind of the pursuit of those virtues that causes a shift in your attention that changes it towards essentially the beautiful, the good, the true. It's like Plato's kind of education by transformation. The entire process is guided by the stack of virtues that allow you to see the good in the bigger sense, become like the good to see the good. But I just think that seems to be missing for me in a lot of broader Christianity. Like it's more of a social kind of function. There's not as much emphasis on like the inner man, like what Christ talks about in terms of this changing of your own heart, which is really seems to be so, fundamentally personal in a sense. And you can't really do it for anybody else. So there's a bit of an obstacle there, but yeah.
Yeah, if I may jump in here. Really appreciate all the points being made so far. What was coming through for me as I listened to the last few threads was a sense that the Christianity that we've inherited, particularly this deontological, more rule-based Christianity, this more social, functional, institutional kind of Christianity, seemed to almost bring things into a middle band in which the suffering and darkness at the bottom is kind of clipped out and the transcendental mystical experience is clipped out. And I would argue that both of these are intimately connected with one another, because the capacity to navigate the darkness and the suffering, which is the core part of the core symbolism of Christianity instantiated in the cross, requires the transcendence of it. Otherwise, people are very unlikely to face it. So that's necessarily transformative in order to come into relationship.
Just to jump in on that, Jacob, sorry, just that idea that you have to die while you're alive in order to really live, like that's how the beatific vision is gained, is through this process of death and rebirth. But that's obviously a big challenge. So perhaps there's a thing that's like, it's easier just to get everybody together and do the things and nobody has to die while they're alive. And, it saves people's feelings a little bit. In the institution.
Yeah. So like the church almost functions as this, this raft, this like staying in flight at the same altitude, let's say. It doesn't necessarily create the kind of container which is affording of an understanding of the actual processes of death and rebirth, which are core to the transformation. And that's certainly what a liminal web philosophical community or a Christianity that goes beyond itself must make available. And I think there's a really powerful poetic arc available to us in this time, having undergone this kind of 2 centuries death of God, with the underlying notion that the core of Christianity is for God to become immanent and die and then be reborn, that Christianity itself must undergo death. And this is a really great framing that takes away a lot of the fear that I think perhaps institutional Christianity has, which is, oh no, we're dying and there's no way out. Actually, this is really a necessary dying. And it seems to me that there's another layer that I want to bring in here, and I'm not sure quite how to connect it yet, but I'll do it anyway. Alongside and perhaps as a product of the death of God in the 19th century, or whenever you want to place it, we have these outbreaks of war on an enormous scale, like an enormity of destruction that's really inconceivable in both the First World War and the Second World War. And we live very much in the wake of both of these conflicts. which occurred in relatively quick succession outside of a spiritual, mystical context, a community of healing, which actually was in touch with that redemptive seed. And so from my standpoint, we're actually sort of in the post-traumatic wake of the 20th century without the resource to necessarily go down into the ground of what's occurred, because we are banded off in this middle place and also saturated with all manner of distractions. We don't have the resource required to go down into the darkness of what we have done. And by which I mean in the Petersonian sense that, we have been the perpetrators and the victims of history. We don't need to just identify as British or Irish or what have you, but we can expand that notion to what have we collectively undergone on the human trip in the 20th century. And so this is the collective trauma healing dimension of a Christianity that goes beyond itself, which necessarily demands an actual realization of mystical transformation and redemption, without which we can't hope to go down and resolve that which lies a few layers under the topsoil. And I would also argue without which we cannot hope to address the contemporary meta crisis, because it is a crisis of connection and embodiment and a spiritual crisis and a healing crisis. So this historical layer is deeply, deeply informing our capacity to address the horizontal, present, circumstantial situation, all of which seems to be flanked by this vertical ontology that's not able to go low enough and not able to go high enough. And the virtues seem to be a kind of roadmap, and the transformative practices seem to be a loosening up, and the plant medicines seem to be a solvent on the rigidity of that vertical ontology.
One of the things that's interesting is you're bringing in the vertical and the horizontal. There has to be a point where it touches down. And I don't know if any of you saw the talk that John Vervaeke gave at the Quest for a Spiritual Home conference on the cognitive science of home. It's very good. I would recommend it if you haven't. But he talks about sort of 3 layers of the establishment of home, and he's talking about it from a evolutionary standpoint of you develop a home range, which is what the organism experiences as a result of the co-shaping of niche construction. The organism shapes the environment, which shapes the organism, which shapes the environment, and this happens, and then you get this home range. And then within the home range, you have multiple entities doing this thing. They come together in a home base, and that's where you communicate. The communitas happens, the community happens. And that happens in the deepest level at the hearth or the hospital around a fire. And to have a centralized point where we come together, where our horizontal dimension of the historicity and the multiplicity of ourselves comes into agreement to access the vertical, is, I think, one of the ways we might understand this sense of the post-traumatic disorder that we experience as a result of the 20th century, like you talked about. I think that's a good way of talking about it. But and I'm wondering, like, tying together this middle band. I like the way how you talked about this middle band of Christianity, that we sort of like fortified the bottom and the top, like especially once this notion of God being dead happened. It's like a lot of people just, okay, well, batten down the hatches, cut off the transcendent, cut off the suffering, because we're just going to preserve what's there. It's like, no, we have to open that up and find a place to touch down again. And that touching down has to happen with real people, and real people are the ones who are able to use the solvent to move through a membrane that's really difficult to move through, and have the sort of courage it takes to descend into those depths. and face that sort of the darkness of which we are all both the darkness in which we all participate both as victim and perpetrator. I think so. I guess what I'm trying to say is to reformulate what you said and say it again, but to suggest that it's the responsibility of us, and maybe this is why we're doing this. This is precisely what we're attempting to do, is form the kind of communities that touch down.
Well, I'll just note that The Republic, which is arguably a great book on education, talks about how early on you need to start with, I believe it's music and gymnastics, and then play. It's emphasis. He really emphasizes, I think, book 6 or 7, maybe 6, where he talks about play. And he's like, be careful before you give these kids all these books and ideas, because they may hate them if they don't start off with play or something. But then he talks about music. And music is not merely just sound. I think it also gets tied to logic, kind of philosophy, mathematics, and all these things are under music. And it's interesting that it's under the category of music, because that's a sense that things have a wholeness, that they go together and there's a kind of transcendence. Like when you play music, if you hit the wrong note, you know you hit the wrong note, but that's really weird. How do you know you hit the wrong note? You just have a sense of a kind of transcendent whole of the notes you're playing before you even start. Likewise with like philosophy, you just know if a point you just made doesn't sound right or doesn't make sense. You just know the question that follows. Well, right here, there's this sense that there's something feeding you that's not you. There's something kind of feeding the next musical note, feeding the next logical point, and not there. And it's interesting because there's almost a sense where if you want to educate someone, they must start with a sense of some kind of transcendent that they're trying to be educated to participate in. If you don't start with that, you're screwed, basically. And we haven't started with that. The second thing is gymnastics, which of course would have a lot of wrestling back then. I've heard it said that wrestling and jiu-jitsu back then were a lot more similar. So, you know, it's interesting to think too that you need to start with something that's dealing with, perhaps you could associate with the animal in the base. So you were talking about the transcendent, and then you talk about with something like the physical, right? And it's also interesting because in gymnastics, if that's a kind of conditioning, you're arguably trying to condition the flesh to be more like the transcendent, because you're trying to be healthier, you're not trying to be as sick, you're trying to condition yourself, but you so condition yourself through pain, through suffering, through difficulty. And it's very interesting to note, if I'm not, how early on Socrates or Plato places that in education. And one of the great problems is you could say that we have not placed that at the foundation of modern education. And so we're very confused, because why are you learning? To get a job. Oh, to get a job. Well, that's great. That's going to get you far. Because that also, the other topic in this that I think is a big deal is what is meant by like Joseph Piper and leisure. We don't know what leisure is now. You know, I know Dr. Niebenhauser will talk about scholé. We think leisure is idleness, when actually idleness is the opposite of leisure. What you see is an education for leisure, which basically, I think even like Aristotle, basically the main question is, what does the human do in leisure? And leisure is the state where basically your activity is completely internally derived. There's no external source. It's what you, according to your own values, are motivated to do and that you think are important to realize the fullness of the human being. So basically, in a de-ontological world, there can't be any good use of leisure. The only work will be the economic work, because the other problem is people think that leisure doesn't entail work, when actually it's the most human work. It's the work of finding the human, but here's the key. Leisure, by definition, cannot be institutionalized. By definition, it cannot be reduced to principles, because it is so much bound to the feedback loop between you and your particularity, and your community, and your jobs, and your calls, and your skills, and your people, that you can't have general deontological principles by which to organize it. Well, that's scary then, because you have to make decisions for yourself. You have to be willing to take a stand for something you believe in and that you believe is right, and you could be wrong. And also, why would you do that if you never had any education about music? Why would you think that you could, in your individuality, participate in some music beyond yourself unless you had that education? Now what happens is people believe making a choice like that is individualistic and atomistic. And in fact, that's all it can be. So you get this kind of pathological state where either people are joining these mass conformity movements, or they're radically isolating, because we don't have a metaphysics of participation that brings together the universal and the particular, that people can then be part of in their communities with one another. And that's one of the great things that a mythos can bring that we don't have together. And then the point with that as well, and then I'll pass it on, is basically basically, without some sort of metaphysical framework, all rationality is conditioned by its metaphysical framework. And so, for example, if we were talking about pain having a value, right? Where do you get that from? Pain hurts. It's not good. If you don't have a metaphysical system like Christianity that actually teaches you that pain has a value, which, by the way, in the experience of pain, that's not given to you by the pain itself. You just have to know that independent of the immediate experience, right? Well, if you don't have any metaphysical framework or sense of the music, as we've described, and how pain gives you an ability to be conditioned for the music, then to be rational would mean you get rid of the pain or you avoid the pain. So here's the problem. Rationality within a deontological world will lead to autocannibalism, will lead to destruction, because the rational response in the immediacy to the things that make us more human is to stop doing those things that make us more human, because the immediate experience of them is, I shouldn't do it. Or so, for example, when you go into community and you feel the anxiety of different people with different beliefs and you're not knowing how to interact with them, the rational response to that from just the immediate experience could be to leave, to never talk to those people again. And the rational thing could be is to find people like you that you then hang out around because that feels better. Oh, goodness. Now rationality is leading deeper into the meaning crisis, deeper into the different problems. So also a reason we need to wrestle with Christianity is precisely to have a better truth. I call it the true isn't the rational. So a truth to organize rationality so that rationality stops getting us deeper into the meaning crisis, but actually works us out of the meaning crisis. But that would require something like a metaphysical principle, virtue, so on and so forth. And the last thing that would mean is that community has to be more so in the business of teaching skills. It's almost like the church has to be more like an art community than a teaching school, right? Like you learn certain principles in an art school, but then everyone does their own project, right? But that automatically brings the fear of anarchy. What if everyone goes off and does their own thing? Well, that's what Ivan Illich is like. You have to face that fear. If you don't face that fear, you're going to squash difference. You're going to lose those skills. You're not going to have the skills to then negotiate between the bottom layer and the top layer, the music and the gymnastics. And as a result, you'll end up in a middle range that is the last man in a Nietzschean sense, or that has no thymos, like Fukuyama will talk about. And once you get there, things just kind of fade off. They just kind of trickle off, and not with a bang, but with a whimper, as T.S. Eliot put it.
There's so much stuff there. I don't even know where to jump in, but it's all such good stuff, man. I'll circle back just to where Jacob was saying with the World War II kind of argument, and then hopefully try and bring some of the other stuff in terms of I really see the death of God idea as the beginning. I look at it in a very kind of Peterson way of this anomaly breaking the frame, like the scientific revolution and multiculturalism hit the Aristotelian Christian worldview and just couldn't deal with it. Like there was no justification at the time. So people said, all right, well, we can't have these two things at the same time, apparently. So Christianity then started to become secondary to the scientific revolution, which became more popular. But that obviously created a value vacuum that caused a lot of this kind of war and a lot of the chaos of the 20th century, even philosophically. Like I look at modernism as an attempt to remake that frame. The idea that woohoo, we can just make another one, and then that didn't work, and then postmodernism comes along and goes, there's never going to be a frame, we're fucked, let's just call it quits. And now we're kind of almost at the next bit of that where it's no wait, maybe we can kind of bring that back together in a sense. Maybe this is I spoke to Brendan what's his last name again, Brendan Graham, but he talks a lot about metamodernism and this kind of period of going back and being able to take the traditional, the modern. But I think a lot of that is just the result of losing the good, which is God, which is the metaphysical guarantee, essentially, that we have some connection to reality. The whole problem of perception, the problem of language and philosophy in the 20th century is just are we connected to reality in any way? And I think without the good, without that guarantee, we aren't. And then the resulting meaning crisis and all of those things. So I think once we have that philosophical reframing again, which I think Vervaeke's work, Peterson's work, they've really done, as far as I'm concerned, they've done a very good job of getting that to a unification of science and spirituality that makes sense. And then I think from there, there's the educational project that Daniel's talking about, which is how do you get this into practices, spiritual exercises, institutions, groups, communities, and start to get people actually kind of practicing this stuff in a way. So for me, it has that, the problem formulation, the new reframing that's going on, and then there's the kind of delivery of it through pedagogical programs, which are very similar to the philosophical programs you pointed out, which were like physical training, dialogical, oftentimes like acting and improv type things, and writing, which are all things that are super, in our technological world, still very relevant. So that's the way I'm kind of thinking about, like, and that Christianity is then the kind of vehicle for that next wave of whatever, a return to a more traditional after this whole crisis. Like,
I like the highlighting of the physical aspect, because one of the things that's so strange to me about Christianity is Christianity's claim and its hope is the redemption of the body, is the resurrection of the body. And yet, while many Christian practices and rituals do involve the body, they don't do it in a way that tends to, like there's no martial arts in Christianity. There's no like, wrestling isn't put forward. It's like, yeah, you kneel when you do these things, like your body participates in the transcendent movement, but it doesn't participate in the finite movement, and you need both. And I think that's one of the things, and maybe this is part of the shadow masculine that Jacob brought up as well. I really think it's a big part of it, because the Christian man who knows how to submit to what is higher, but doesn't know how to use his body in a movement back towards his animal self. Like, that energy is there, and it's going to be there, and it's going to find a way to express itself. And if it doesn't in me, then somehow I'm going to transpose that onto my son, who's, going to transpose it to his son. And then that's going to happen. And I think this is true both in terms of the conflict aspect of embodiment, but also very much in the frame of sexuality as well. And I think this is where the whole conversation about the progressive LGBTQ type side of this question and the sexual revolution and all of that, like the repression of sexuality as being sort of, I think most people in Christianity have understood it as being somewhat as a negative overall, right? It's like, no, like there's that we need to have a proper understanding and place of value and glorification in and through embodiment, in the finite level of our embodiment, and especially in the sexual aspect.
Yeah, okay. Some really, really interesting moves being made today, gentlemen. And I have to just give a little applause to Daniel for that very, very poetic riff that just occurred. But I really like what we're building out here, and the move that Ken made a little while back, really shifting the lens from not just what is the landscape of ideas, what is the ontological landscape of the new Christianity, or the integration of Christianity, but how does that ultimately come together and occur between people? And this, of course, is about as core to Christianity as the cross in many ways, is the gathering around the hearth, the gathering together into some form of communion. And then we have this notion of the pedagogical, the educational, as really core to that, and core to the transformative aspect of that as well. And so I think that when we look around in culture today, it's pretty damn clear that people are all going to the gym for some reason, right? and I'm not saying that Christianity should be like this project of Christianity beyond itself need not be an attempt to create a new empire that integrates all the good things into itself. But as a dynamic mycelial network of networks, it can have a kind of flourishing which invites and dynamically includes different qualities that are available in the culture. And you can imagine, like different spores of this kind of community, all attempting different aspects of that. But why shouldn't gathering together in this community not include gymnasia, not include wrestling? Why isn't there the possibility of a yoga before the prayer? So there's a real creativity that's needed, and I don't know quite how that as the question that's gathering for me is like, are we in a sense just continuing to, through this creative process, through this dialogos, through these communities, through further gatherings, through the artistic creation of resources? And boy, I really love this idea of the Christian community as basically a pedagogical artistic community, because how much more dynamic would that be if your body of Christ, if your church congregation is constituted of all these different people going off and doing different things, which then pollinate and have different effects? That's very beautiful. And that's something that I would definitely like to participate in. So losing the thread a little bit there because I was really excited about that. But it's almost like, how does this, as Ken sort of framed at the beginning, how does this meet with the institutional train that's chugging along? Like, how do we get to a point where the thing that's occurring here and elsewhere has a degree of substance and reality? And of course, core to that is the love and relationship and the field of wisdom between the people. How does that get to a place where its material instantiation is now like a church somewhere is saying, we see you, we see what you are doing, we're in dialogue with you, and we want to invite you in to do dialogos practices inside of our church, or we want to open up to different kinds of art occurring in the church, or like this kind of real relationship and exchange with the old and the new actually coming into form, and not just being something cool that I think about and imagine. Wouldn't that be cool if that could happen?
Well, I'll jump in. I appreciate everything that everyone is saying because I think it's outstanding. So a few things come to mind. First, as a note, it is interesting. Jesus is a carpenter, but we don't really ever see him doing carpenter. Paul is making tents. We don't see him making tents. He's doing these extraordinary traveling. We don't see. There's a lot of masculine, of these kind of physical exertions, difficulty in the background of the stories of the gospel. And I think that's a hint on one of the ways we can start thinking about the dark masculinity. It's in the background, but it's very much there. And in fact, Jesus, you could argue that part of Jesus's humility is powerful precisely because he is God and could summon down all the angels to destroy the world if he wanted, and he doesn't. And he's also talking about meekness, which is not weakness, but a kind of holding back of the horses, I've heard it said. And if he's a carpenter, that would mean he's quite physically capable. So this should be noted. Another thing is, one of the reasons it becomes very difficult to talk about these, like the new church or wrestling with Christianity, the world today, is because you have a slew of faulty premises in all of these different fields: metaphysics, ontology, epistemology, politics, et cetera, so forth, that are all feeding one another. And in order to kind of fix the problem, you have to do it down the entire stack. And I think that's kind of, I believe that's like where Dr. Henriquez or Vervaeke or Wolfgang Smith have that sort of impulse. So for example, one of the great things that is destroying the world is the notion of certainty, that you can't have truth unless you have certainty. There's a great thinker named Leslie Numbog. He wrote a book called Proper Competence. And there's also another extraordinary thinker named Michael Ponier, who wrote an insanely important book called Personal Knowledge. And let me just sum it up the following way. He says the only things that have any hope of making contact with reality are those that can be wrong. Because if it cannot be wrong, then the only way that something that cannot be wrong can make contact with reality is if reality is stagnant and doesn't change. But if reality is a changing thing, and better yet, for Planier, us actually engaging in reality is a participation in reality of which changes reality, then of course you can't have certainty, no more than you can have certainty in the direction a story is going before you complete it. And so you have to replace certainty with confidence. You can certainly have confidence that you believe that language is working, even if you can never know for sure that the language corresponds, because you guys seem to be nodding. And I actually know quite clear when I say something that doesn't make sense, because everyone goes, oh, right? So you can falsify, in a Popperin sense, the effectiveness of language. And then if there's a failure of language, we can say those words didn't correspond, not all of language, right? And so there's this entire notion that we have to move from confidence from certainty. But if the options are only certainty or nothing, well, since certainty is not possible in this life, nihilism is what epistemically follows. The other big problem is the ontological notion of correspondence. Can we correspond with reality? Well, that only makes sense if things exist. And if things don't exist, instead everything is just relations and a kind of a Whitehead, Owen Barfield, Bergson kind of sense, then there are no things. So of course you can't correspond with them. But does that mean you don't make contact with reality? Well, if you're actually part of the very situation in which that thing is located and there are no things in themselves, only situations in themselves that you are part of, then of course you can make contact with that thing because you are part of it in participation. The negation, sublation in a Hegelian sense of coherence and correspondence is participation. And like what Owen Barfield makes is that famous example of the rainbow, where he asks, is a rainbow there? You say, well, of course it's there. It's not a hallucination, but there's a certain condition you have to meet to see the rainbow. There has to be raindrops. You have to be here. You have to look there. And that creates the situation of a rainbow. And the rainbow is real. And basically what Owen Barfield is saying is all of reality is that way. And actually, belief in things independent of situation is idolatry, because you are saying that things can be the ground of their own existence. So here's the problem. We've asked questions about church as a thing, masculinity as a thing, people as things, and all of that has led to forms of idolatry, following Owen Barfield. We have to ask masculinity as a situation, church as a scene, to use Dave's term from Say Theory Underground. We have to ask about epistemology as a participation, ergo a situation. Leibniz, based on Mr. Morley's outstanding books, it's funny, Leibniz basically argues we shouldn't talk about metaphysics, we should only talk about metageometry, because all metaphysics is ultimately a geometrical coordination. I've heard Mr. Vervaeke mention this with the through line and like Neoplatonism and how in the gymnasium there's only geometry. One of the problems is that the brain, in the act of focusing to understand, reduces. Thought itself is a reducing entity, of which when you ask about the bookshelf makes it seem like the bookshelf is a thing independent of the situation of room. So the very nature of thought is to basically trick you. The very nature of thought and understanding already is setting you up to make a mistake, unless you move from, say, understanding to reason in Hegel, which is where you focus and then release. Focus and then release. And that mental act of focusing on something and then resituating it, if you cannot do that, you will not be engaging in metageometry, and by definition, you will be engaging in an effacement as opposed to an error that might be necessary for you to get to truth. So if, for example, if we must focus on the bookcase to understand the entire situation, that's an error, but it's necessary for us to understand the situation. But if I start saying the bookcase is a thing in itself, the error has now become an effacement. It's become a full-fledged falsity, right?
Oh dear.
I guess we're holding for a moment here.
You're muted, man.
Oh, I believe he's frozen.
Ah, dear, the epic riff.
He was getting to some good stuff.
Man, that is wonderful.
About to drop some knowledge.
Yeah, very, very densely woven garment of
Yeah.
knowledge.
No kidding. That's great.
The
I
living
think
Wikipedia. All right,
yeah,
he's just dropped off of the room, so I guess he's just figuring out his internet has dropped off.
you know that ontology is correspondence versus conformity, or knowledge is conformity. Like Man, that's a huge difference.
It's a big shift, isn't it, man? I'm reading that Aspects of Truth that
Oh yeah.
Mikey recommended, the Catherine Pickstock
Oh
one,
yeah.
which is super dense. But that does seem to be that change from that representational theory of truth to the conformity theory of truth really seems to change the whole Cartesian framework. Like, it's a big step from the propositional tyranny to like transcendence. Something I want to flesh out more, but it's like you pull on one thread of it and you're like, oh my God, I'm just having to read Kant all day and it's nightmare
Well, it's
stuff.
like there's so much underneath that has to be. What I find, right, the only way that I can do any of this stuff is by making it real in my own life. And so I seem to be completely incapable of holding on to notions that don't land in an embodied sense. And so, like, I've sort of had to learn to surrender to the amount of time that it takes to just allow things to shift slowly.
Yeah. With that one, with the conformity thing, it kind of reminds me of like the education you get in school versus the skills I've had to learn as an adult to kind of do things in life. Like, you have Aristotle uses that example of the who knows how to build a chair better, the person who can draw like perfect blueprint of a chair, the person who can actually build a chair. I think it's very much like the education system at the moment is very much the how to build it, like the blueprinting kind of thing. It's all this representational, propositional knowledge. And the void is the other kind, which is like how to transform yourself, how to become a different person, how to actually, have a successful relationship and act it out. We haven't really built a system of education that works that way. And I think maybe that's what the church was doing, like as a system of transformation with all the rituals like that you'd act out. But that doesn't really seem to work if you don't believe in the rituals. Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. You
Yeah.
guys have done the rituals. I haven't even done them, so I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
Did your
Well,
communion and confirmation and that kind of stuff? Like,
I can say just from my perspective that it's a completely different experience. And I'm still quite on the outside. But it's an entirely different experience when it becomes a symbol instead of an idol.
yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Where are you at with it, Jacob?
In which respect?
With the rituals of Christianity?
I have been engaged in serious play with the rituals of Christianity over the last year. And I'm viewing them as, a kind of ritual magic of state shifting. Things like using the holy water when I enter a church, making the sign of the cross has been very effective for me also. I'm finding the physical posture of prayer, prostration, raising the elbows and the hands kind of above the body. All of these things are actually turning out, as I had suspected when I was studying Islam years ago. There is some sort of wisdom or knowledge in the physical postures that actually is adducive of whatever state they point to. So I've been playing with that, and it's been Daniel's back joining us. I've been playing with that to good effect, and also, expanding that playfully. For example, with the conscious cannabis, when I'm engaging in a conscious cannabis. Welcome back, Daniel. We'll be weaving right back in. I will kind of put a blessing on that and set intention before that experience, and that has a prayer-like quality, and saying grace and different things like that I've also been doing. So I think there's a huge amount of leeway for this. But a thread I wanted to pick up from what Daniel was saying, which felt really astute, emerging from this whole elucidation of the kind of participant observer relationship to reality and the reality of a rainbow, is that in some ways I see myself as still treating church institutionally as an idol. Even for all the journey I've been on into this thing I'm calling psychedelic Christianity, where I really feel the symbols are coming to life in a very particular and different kind of holographically instantiated way, where it's like it's not happening in the church, it's like a random person you meet on the street, and it's like something is kind of symbolically playing out through this context that is reflective of the larger Christian narrative structure. So if we reconceive of the institution of church as a scene, and we conceive of what we are participating in as also a kind of scene, then it kind of levels the playing field. And of course, you do want to go where you feel like the real deal, as Terence McKenna would put it, is happening. And that's ultimately what it's all about. And there's a whole lot of kind of blueprint type confusion about what it is we ought be doing in this life and in this world, and what is the representation of having made it and doing it properly, and so on and so forth. And a lot of that is bound up with institutional credibility and certification and all that stuff. But if the quality you've seen is generative of virtue, communion, and hopefully creativity, then that seems to be kind of where it's at. And if that can come into dynamic relationship with other scenes, other churches, then that's great. But we can kind of let go of the idea that actually there's still a subtle goal of like it has to take over or happen inside of or supplant or something. It has to take over the old thing of the traditional church scene in order for it to be successful or legit or what have you. So with that, pass it back to you, and welcome back, Daniel.
So first off, we just proved that the internet is not a thing in itself, independent of the situation of massive haze messing up the internet dome. So forgive me for that. I assume you were like, I assume like the idea that anything that's thought of as a thing in itself, whether it be masculinity, church, Christianity, not a situation, is going to lead to idolatry. And basically that right there, like we think of what is masculinity as a situation, what is like church as a situation, that changes our thinking, because it also means that there's the key terms would be coordination and conditioning. And I like conditioning because that mixes the gymnastics. Conditioning is also for me the middle zone between objective and subjective. Like, for example, if you want to experience a shadow, an object has to be located here with the sun and it meets the condition to create a shadow. Is that objective or subjective? No, there's a certain condition that has to be met for there to be a shadow. And then you look at, like, in Praise of Shadows with the Japanese thinkers, like all of architecture needs to be conditionally based. Well, likewise, if indeed we have to be in a certain condition to experience the rainbow, we also have to meet the condition as a person to have our eyes open, to be willing to see a rainbow, and so on and so forth. And this would also suggest that the kind of truth, beauty, and goodness that you experience is relative to the conditioning that you put yourself under, and then what conditions you are in to be so experiencing a different condition of reality. I like to call it conditionalism. I think it aligns with what the great D.C. Simba was saying about there are certain, like, truth is something you have to raise yourself to. It's not just readily available if you have the right method. You have to do certain conditions. Oh, wait, well, then gymnastics and music go together, because gymnastics is where you condition yourself to experience certain music. So this is the thing. How can the church be a place that conditions people to experience the music of Christianity that works back on them and makes them more like Christ? And the structure, and then I'll pass it on, seems to be something more of what we see in Paul, which you could say is a decentralized collection of scenes, not an institutional church, where you have a bunch of home churches basically that are coordinating with one another, that are developing certain scenes, that makes mistakes, and then Paul writes a letter. And really, we have to realize that when Paul is writing, he's not so much in his mind writing Holy Scripture. He's writing letters to help coordinate decentralized scenes in line with the revelation of Christ that people are really confused about and are wrestling with. And they're not sure. They're genuinely not sure. So they're asking Paul. So Paul is often coordinating decentralized scenes that are connected by those letters on how to engage in the right practice that makes one closer to the true, the beautiful, and the good. The problem, and think about it as well, it took months for a letter to arrive. And so in that period, people were rather alone. They would have felt like they weren't connected with an institution. And then the letter arrives 5 months later. Oh, we are connected with something beyond ourselves, right? But a lot of the time, they are their own scene, making their own particular situations. It becomes difficult to avoid mass centralization and institution, where you have quick information flows, massive, like this could get into like Paul Virilio or like, Marcia, like where you where churches can know what all other churches are doing at all other time. Then they can always be judging one another, demanding conformity to their scene, which creates anxiety that to then defend your scene, you have to stand against. And that requires conditioning in its own right that you're being told you shouldn't be doing because Jesus wouldn't want you to do that. So we have to think of what would it look like to have the church be a decentralized collection of scenes that coordinate with one another, not in terms of, say, judging one another, but to help one another determine the right skills and practices so they can condition one another to be more like Christ, which ultimately will get into the question of what it means to be free, which seems to have something to do with fitting with the true, the good, and the beautiful. So decentralized coordination seems to be something that might also be at play with this question of scenes.
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that because it really fits in with the way I'm thinking about this in terms of there's a difference between in philosophy, Pierre Hadot talks about philosophy as a way of life, which is that previously in ancient philosophy, they didn't look at it as propositional arguments all the time. It was about how you lived and the type of character that you had. And it was an operation that you did on yourself, like what Verticality talks about, the Socrates teaching me how to dialogue with myself, and that as the institution of the church, if that fails, really what needs to be done is that people themselves are trying to imitate Christ. They're trying to live out the spirit of the Christian story in their own lives. And then perhaps people gather together for rituals and do things like that, but more like almost like what the wellness self-development space is online, where people are really doing it because they love it and because they want the sense of meaning and community that comes from it. But to have it within a very solid Christian metaphysic ontology and connecting it to the tradition as well. But I think that's what will make it a bit more alive again.
Yeah, and I think it's so easy to fall into the trap of treating it as a thing. I think that's a really good way of this is something that I've done many times, and I think oftentimes just by virtue of how language works, it comes out this way. But I more and more find myself reticent to criticize, because it's like, well, what are you criticizing exactly? Because it's always different and it's always something. And I don't want to be someone who's trying to reinvent something. I'd rather be a part of a reinventio, which is a different thing. I won't go into that because there's not that much time, but you can look at some of Vervaeke explicates that well.
Yeah, really lovely. Thing that's coming to me is like instead of a churching, like playing with the language in ways that affirms the dynamic, conditional nature of these things. And so when we think of the church or the churches, we really think of churchings, different churchings, and what are the qualities of those churchings. And of course, that naturally evokes the notion that there's different kinds of churchings that are different in different conditions. And I feel there's a kind of Christian humility in pursuing and participating in what feels most like the communion and community of Christ, without too much thought and expectation of what occurs beyond that, and especially insofar as that shifts into blueprints and empires. And so this, I really, really appreciate the reinventio spirit that Daniel has brought here in terms of reframing the role of Paul and the early Christian communities as decentralized scenes, experimenting with ecologies of practice based on different conditions in dialogue with one another. And this feels like a kind of pretty vital, healthy map of how we might consider what it is we are participating in. And I feel very encouraged by that, because it also, by its decentralized nature, by its experimental nature, affords the kind of experimentation that we pretty desperately need in terms of the pieces I was laying out at the outset. And I think there's a whole lot more creative reinventio to be done about what we think Christianity is. I made a recent discovery at the Cloisters Museum in New York, in which I found a sculpture of the Visitation from a 12th century church involving an angel giving what seemed to be mushrooms to the Virgin Mary, and hoping to write about that soon. But I think that when we open ourselves to it, the reinventio will reveal itself to us, and the resources will become available to give words and image and art to what it is that actually is fitted and needed for this time. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming to this, for participating, for laying down that philosophical fire. Really good stuff, gentlemen. Any closing remarks from all of you? Otherwise, just blessed to continue this, because it feels like so at the vital, nourishing edge for me.
Yeah, for sure. Just to say thanks for setting this up, Jacob, and to the guys. This has been really great. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully we can do it again, because it does feel very alive and very relevant to times we're in.
Yeah, likewise, I've enjoyed it. Oh, sorry. Nothing better.
No, I've enjoyed it immensely. It's wonderful to have this opportunity and to speak. And no, I think it helped. A lot of times we don't know what to do with Paul, because we think of him creating the institution. It's more so now, it's actually a more complicated picture. It's actually more like Constantine creates the institutional church, where Paul is a decentralization of coordinating different scenes. And so there's a lot there, especially when we understand that Paul is responding to live situations that Jesus never directly spoke on, that he has to think in light of the particular circumstance with the revelation of Christ. And so there's a very live, active thinking, which is combining revelation and reason, not one or the other. But since we tend to read Romans or Corinthians, and yes, there are obviously a lot of theological premises here, but they are situated within the lived experience of those people for the sake of illuminating their situations. And I think the last point would be that the question becomes, if everything is situational, the point becomes, what is the goal or metric of those situations? What are we trying to create in said situations? And I think it does have something to do with, as Mr. Stendler DC was saying, on what actually is human freedom. Human freedom is to be basically something like a flow state, the art state, lost in themselves. Dallas Willard has that wonderful line where he says, freedom is not a child that gets to eat chocolate whenever they want to. Freedom is found in that person listening to a performance of Mozart that can't help but leap out of their seat and clap their hands when they hear it. That's freedom, because that's a fitted net of getting lost in yourself. And it would seem to be that what we have to think is, what does it mean to take seriously the fact that human beings are creating situations and needing to make situations and scenes of which then they forget themselves in? What does it mean to have a kind of self-forgetfulness, not a selflessness, not a selflessness, to use Timothy Keller's term, but you're lost in something? What does it mean to be trained in the skills and arts and conditions so that indeed you feel like you're just free and something beyond yourself, not because you make a point to degrade yourself, but because yourself meets the condition of being able to forget itself in something greater than itself. And I think when you speak about the psychedelics, the mystical, the flow state, all of these things are speaking about a human condition in which the bound between us and the music is lost, and we become a note in that very music. And then the music, and then we're not merely a note, we are in fact part of that music. And the question becomes, what are the conditions that we can meet? What are the situations that we can undergo? What are the practices that we can set ourselves to, so that we can live in that situation where we lose ourselves in something? Because it is only when we lose ourselves that we find ourselves, because it is only the one who dies that will live.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for everyone who joined us today.
Thank you.